Hi, I'm Paul Marcel. You can tell we're going to have a fun review when we got the place covered in a drop cloth. Today I'd like to review the Gryphon C40 diamond bandsaw. This is a saw that I used just recently in my no comment build number 2, which we like to call the Burton Table, when I was cutting a piece of Onyx and doing all these bevel cuts and such. I did all that using this diamond saw, and it's actually really easy to use for a number of different types of materials. Now, when would you want to use a diamond bandsaw? Of course, when you're doing the Onyx cuts like I was doing for that project, but also if you're cutting different types of natural stone tiles, or if you're getting, you can get some of the larger pieces of like marble, like this is from a marble countertop, and I have plenty of other nice material samples here that I get these actually from a granite shop. So all these stones can be cut very easily using this wet diamond bandsaw. Now the bandsaw itself couldn't be easier the way it's put together. It almost looks like a kid's saw because it's all made out of plastic. So all the parts are plastic, brass, stainless steel, or aluminum. So it's pretty much going to be durable whenever it gets wet. So the table simply pops right off. This back section here just lifts right out of the 2 posts that we have back here. So I can take that off for a second to show you what the insides look like. So inside here we basically have a big bucket for the water. There's going to be some sponges for controlling splashes that we're going to go through in a moment. The wheel that's on the bottom, it all comes pre-calibrated from the factory. There are some instructions for doing a recalibration if for some reason something goes wrong. And they do actually send you some spare parts. Now it's very much like a regular bandsaw. It's got a lower guide, and it also has an upper guide for the blade that we'll see when I put this all back together. And then there's actually some blade tensioning. Now, the blade tensioning, the reason I mention this now before I put this back together, is we have this little plastic post hiding back here. This is used to act as a stop post. So when I put this thing back together, it'll lower down until it hits that stop post. And what this is it's all pre-calibrated at the factory to tension the blade, because you're going to install the blade here on the inside. The motor itself is mounted on a pivot point. We have a pivot point right here. So it'll just rotate right there. Now the motor is pretty heavy, and that's actually what sets the tensions between the sort of stretch set by the post and then the weight of the motor that's pulling up over here on the bandsaw blade. That's what sets your tension. So you don't have any of the normal cranking that you have to do on a normal bandsaw. Now to install the blade, we end up taking the table off, but I did want to point out one thing about this table, and that's these little acrylic sheets that are hiding on the top. Now, I purchased this saw through Paul Schürch. Paul Schürch buys these saws as a distributor, and then he modifies them and then resells them. So that's what I have here. If you get this from a different distributor, you won't get these 2 acrylic sheets on it. What these sheets are for is for setting bevel angles on cuts. So basically this one top sheet can be tilted a couple different ways. It comes with a simple wedge that you're going to be able to use to set bevels, since there really isn't any provision with this saw out of the box for doing bevel cuts like that. Now to install the blade, we'll first talk about the blade. It comes with a regular blade, and there are actually 2 different blades that you can get for this saw. One of them is the regular duty, and then there's a heavy duty. Now the blade itself, when you're looking at it, of course it's got a coating of diamonds on the front. That's going to be the cutting edge. But also, if you take a look at it up close, it's just about almost 50% of it on the sides is also diamond. So that's actually very useful. For one thing, of course, it's going to help open the kerf. The diamonds on the front are going to cut, and then the ones on the side here are going to help open the kerf. But what makes it really nice is that when you're cutting some material, and say you go to finish the cut, but then you have a little bit of the material there because it broke off or whatever, you can pretty much just rub it up against the side of the blade and it'll take care of it. It also is helpful, I found, when I was making a cut and it started to deviate away, that you could kind of run back and forth near the side of it to file down the edge to get yourself back on the line. So I did have to do that actually quite often with the Onyx. Now to install the blade, all we do is we're going to tuck it around the bottom wheel, which has what feels like a little bit of a rubber tire on it. And then for the top one here, we're just going to put it up on one side and give the wheel a spin. And it's hooked on. Now it's just fine. Now of course, just like a bandsaw blade, as you turn this a couple times, it's going to kind of track itself correctly onto the wheels. Now there is a guide on the bottom here, just like you would expect on a regular bandsaw, and all it is a piece of hard plastic. They give you a couple replacement pieces that have a groove in it so that the blade can sit inside that groove to keep it from tracking. Now there is one for the top here that we simply snap on in place, Just pushes in like that and gives you this much clearance. One of the other nice things about this saw is management of the splash while you're cutting. Normally you'd get a lot of splash with the water carrying up with the blade. So they get you two different sponges and some recesses down here where you can jam the sponges in. So let me go ahead and put one in. I've got a bucket of water hiding back here. Just get that sponge wet. And then there's one of the spots is right underneath the bottom wheel. So there's some plastic recesses that's sort of guided in. You can kind of jam this thing underneath. If you give this a little bit of a spin, it'll kind of carry it through. So in a lot of ways, this acts like that little brush that's in the bottom of your bandsaw. Then we're going to get the other one wet, and we're just going to tuck it in back here. So this is going to help manage the amount of splash that comes off. Then, of course, we fill the well with water. There's a small fill line at the bottom, and then we're just going to slide the table right back into place, and then we're ready to go. It goes that quickly. So for a demonstration, I'm going to be cutting this pretty thick piece of marble here to sort of square off a piece. One of the other things I wanted to mention that I did actually forget earlier when I was talking about the various materials that you can cut is cutting glass. Actually, you can go very fast with glass. So it's actually a favorite among people who do stained glass. All right, well, we're ready to go. Let me move a couple things around and we'll get to cutting this stone. Now, the way I'm going to do these cuts is not the normal way with this saw, but I want it to be very visible how it's working so you can get a good view. And that is, I'm going to do the cuts standing from the side. So one of the things that's interesting to note about this saw is that it's pretty light. And of course, I've got it sitting on some really slick plastic, so it's not going to help. But when I was doing the cuts for the Onyx before, I did have a problem with sort of chasing the saw around a little bit. But it isn't a real big problem because normally if you're doing some of the small marquetry style cuts, your hands are here and you're doing all close work, or you're back here. So your hands are on it. It's not really going to move very much. When I was doing a lot of the cuts for the Onyx that were like that, it didn't move at all. It was only when I had the larger piece at first being cut down. And that's why I always keep my old hockey sticks. There we go, hockey stick and a pair of clamps to hold it, to keep it from wanting to slide back and forth. All right, so what we're going to do here is I'm just going to cut off, this is a kind of a broken, scrapped off piece of a counter. So this was an offcut. There's some broken chipped parts here and stuff. I'm just going to go ahead and cut this thing squared off to give me kind of a nice edge. I don't care if it's perfectly square. Now, one thing people like to use when they're dealing with a stone is they might use like a grease marker like you use when you're doing tile work. But what I find is that, for one thing, it's kind of messy and it's a big fat line. And whenever I've drawn it, there's so many skips that it's not really worth it. So what I did in my project is I just used blue tape. So for me, the blue tape worked much, much better because I can put this on here, stretch it across to make a nice line. Now, sure, blue tape isn't going to stick when it gets really, really sopping wet, but honestly, I'm going to be done the cut long before I get to that point there. And what's also kind of nice is I noticed that when you're cutting with this and the diamond blade kind of starts to bump up against the blue tape, it tends to cause a little bit of resistance. It makes it easier for you to track that line. Now, I don't know how well I'm going to be tracking when I'm pushing it through this way here, but we're going to see. So we can spin this thing up and see how the blade is tracking. And as soon as I did that, the blade pulled itself back in and is all nice and snug inside that guide. Now you are going to notice that there's considerably more flex here than, say, in a woodworking bandsaw setup. This is, again, because we're cutting really hard material. It doesn't really care if there's a blade in it, and it'll snap a blade. So we tend to go for a more flexible blade with a little bit more give to it. All right, well, let's have some fun cutting. actually stayed fairly close to the line. I will say this is the most unusual way to cut, doing it sideways like that, but it still worked out. One thing you might have noticed is that I was adjusting the tracking quite a bit, so sometimes I was actually moving it a lot. It has a lot to do with density. When you're going through these different stones, especially things like this marble or especially the onyx, there are a lot of different areas that are very, very different in density, and you really notice it when you traverse, in the case of the onyx, say from a black to a white or to a yellow, just how much different the blade would track. It's easy enough to do, just slow down when that would happen, then use the sides of the diamonds in order to nudge yourself back over. But for the most part, I've got something here, this being the offcut, but for cutting on a bandsaw like that with a stone, you can see that I actually came up with a fairly good cut. This is something that I would be able to hone with a stone fairly quickly in order to get this thing nice and flat. Now, one of the things you might be wondering about is that this is actually stone that was created as a slab for doing things like countertops and things like vanities and such. So that's how come they've got this fiberglass that reinforces it. They use that during transit. So you might be tempted to take that off right away. It actually helps hold it all together, keeps it from wanting to crack. But the nicer thing about it for us is that all these little pockets in here make it that it's really easy to move. Otherwise you might get so much water under there that you kind of get a little bit of a vacuum, and it makes it hard to push. Plus slurry is underneath there, that helps clear that out. So keep that on, you can remove it very easily afterwards. So you could see a little bit of water coming off of the saw, but for the most part there really isn't a lot on this table. But also make sure that you have just enough water in the basin to just get up about 3/4 of the way on the bottom sponge. If you have more than that, sure, you won't have to add water as often, but then most of that extra water is just going to come splashing right out. So now to show just how easy it is to clean this and take it all down, let me just unplug it real quickly here. There's not a heck of a lot to it. Take the table off. Now inside normally you'd get a lot more slurry. We only ended up making one large cut here, but then to take off the blade, just going to slide off the upper cover. Just tilt up the motor. That's going to make it a little bit easier. Remove some of the tension and it'll pop right off. Now the bottom one, you've got that sponge in there which is kind of holding the thing in. So now the nice thing about this design with this plastic bucket, the whole way that everything is pretty much waterproof, all you're going to do is just going to pour off all this water and then hose it off. Now I'm kind of pointing that out even though you're thinking, well, of course. But what's cool about their design is that there's all these plastic posts here on the outside. This one here still has a hole in it. The reason why they did that is if I wanted to wash this down, I can maybe add a little bit more water to make it a little easier, get the wheel kind of clean. And then now to dump it out though is super simple because you can lift this thing up and pour it out through this post. And it really can't get any easier than that. But you can see how when I've done the work with it before, every time cleaning this thing is actually not a chore. So the other nice thing about that little corner is because there's all these lips on here, if it didn't have that, pouring it all out, you'd get so much crud built up on the inside here, it would just be a real nuisance. So they really put a little bit of thought into the worst part about using a wet saw. Now this marble is actually something I want to use in a future project, so I don't want to just keep chopping it all up for a demo. But what I think you would get as a better demo is maybe to take a look back at my no comment number 2 build video where I did all the work on this onyx, cutting it down and then doing some, there's actually 2 bevels on each edge here and then how I worked it afterwards. So what I've included here is a little floating box that you can click on and that'll take you to the video actually to just before I start doing all the work with the Gryphon. So you can just watch that section, see how it works, see how I worked the stone after it was done without actually having to watch the entire build video.